Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to our colleagues around the world. This is Apaaci's flagship program, Science to Action. It's a platform where eminent scientists and clinician scientists who in their careers have been able to move scientific discoveries into actionable items, processes, and actually make changes through therapies, policies, advisories, or new research bases. This platform selects highly eminent scientists to talk about their vision and their experiences of integrating science and decision making and or creating change. Today we have with us Professor Dr. Katie Allen, who is a member of Parliament from Higgins, and I will introduce subsequently. But I'd like to first welcome Dr. Katie Allen.
Thank you, Ruby.
So we are very honored to have you on this platform, which is crucial to our Apaaaci community as well as the global community. I would like to introduce Dr. Katie Allen, who has been generous and been on several of our initiatives as a member of Parliament from Higgins. Primarily, Dr. Katie Allen is a clinician, a pediatrician, and a professor at the University of Melbourne and the University of Manchester, and director of the Australian Centre of Food and Allergy Research. She has also been the director of Population Health Research, theme of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and an inaugural fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, working closely with the World Health Organization as well as with the US National Academy of Sciences. Currently, she sits on the Joint Standing Committee for Trade and Investment, the National Broadband Network, the Parliamentary Library, Industry Innovation, Science and Resources, and Communication and the Arts. It is our great honor and pleasure that a colleague of ours has moved from an achieving, highly cited clinician scientist to policy making and public affairs. And we welcome you, Katie, to this program. So with this, I'd like to ask you my first question. Katie, as a clinician scientist, what really inspired you in your early days to pursue this career path?
Thank you very much, Ruby, and thank you to everyone who's listening. As Ruby has so eloquently put, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever part of the world you are listening to this podcast or screening that Ruby and I are having conversation. And being here in Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we stand here in Australia. It's one of our greetings, and to pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. So I suppose the first thing to say is that I come from a long line of doctors. My mother was a nurse and my father was a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor. My grandmother was a nurse. My great auntie was a doctor. And in fact, my two daughters are both studying medicine. So we are a family that have served the health of our community for generations. And it's a huge privilege to serve your community as a local doctor. But soon after becoming a doctor, I felt this need to do better. I wanted to continue to help my patients, but not just help them when they're inside my office, but actually help prevent them coming into my office. So without realizing it, I was trying to fix the system. And as a pediatrician, I think pediatricians have always been about the whole family. They've always been about more than just the child. They've been about the parents and the siblings, but also they've been more than just about treating the family. They've been about preventing conditions and about helping children in their lifelong development. And so pediatricians think holistically in the first place. So in fact, having that discipline of being a pediatrician, I think gave me that initial interest in doing better. And we know pediatrics has been behind some of the most important public health changes the world has ever seen, whether it's been good sanitation or vaccination. Those are the things that have really changed the world's health, not just in some countries, but in every country. So pediatricians have always been at the forefront of doing things better. We're holistic in the way that we see things. We're long-term thinkers in the way we're thinking about children and their lifelong journey. But we also understand prevention. It's in our DNA. And so I suppose the best thing to say was, in order to do better, I got involved in research. And as an example of that, it's a bit like, in a house where you're doing the washing up. You can keep doing the washing up in a certain way, or you can renovate the house to make sure the system is more efficient rather than all the dishes piling up in one corner. So I wanted to renovate the health system. And an example of that was when I was in Chicago doing my fellowship, and I was doing my training in pathology. And I said to the professor I was working with, I don't know if I can look at thousands and thousands of pathology slides without, understanding why I was looking at them. I know I have to do this for my training, but is there some way I can get through this month of pathology? I'm not sure that I have the patience. And Professor Whittington, who was a mentor of mine at the University of Chicago, and then subsequently at the Northwestern University of Chicago in the United States, said to me, "Why don't you pose a question? Because then you are actively thinking about things." And I said, "Okay, well, what's the question?" And he said, "Well, we've got a case with centrilobular necrosis of this liver slides. And we know that the mortality is really high for these patients, but we don't know why. We know that 1 in 3 children who've had a liver transplant have centrilobular necrosis die. Do you think you could look at all the slides with centrilobular CLN for the last 10 years and see if you can find any associations for why they might be more likely to die?" So I spent months looking at that, and I looked at 1,000 cases, and I published a paper, and we found there were a number of different causes that were associated with CLN on liver biopsies post-liver transplant. And then soon after we published this paper, we were on a liver ward round, and a case came up which had CLN. And Professor Whittington said to me, "So, Katie, you are now the world expert in this case. What do you think is the cause?" And I said, "Well, it has to be A, B, and C. If not A, it's not B, then it must be C." And he said, "Well, we've looked at C. We did an ultrasound and it wasn't, hepatic artery was fine." And I said, "We have to try harder. It has to be that. It can't be anything else." So they did an arteriogram and they found the hepatic artery had thrombosed. And the next day, the child got a liver transplant and went on to have a very successful outcome. And to me, that gave me the addiction for problem solving in science. I was no looking back then. And I went on to do a PhD and further work because I needed the discipline and the training in order to solve problems. And it was a very addictive moment in my clinical career that it's great to serve patients, but if you can do better by finding the reasons for why they've got a condition, or if you can help make their lives better, that's really, really addictive.
Oh, wonderful. This is really wonderful to hear, Katie. In fact, the second question actually covers a part of what you have said, but please do elaborate on it. Is, as a successful clinician scientist, which is very tough because when you're a clinician scientist, you're taking care of patients and then you need that extra time to actually do the science, and it takes time to do science. And then even further as a woman, because you're multitasking, taking care of your family in addition to all this. So it's a tough call. And what would you say were the highlights of the key points in your career, the highlights? And what were the key achievements, but also what were the challenges?
Thank you, Ruby. And I think that's the life of investigative researcher, is there's many highs and there's many lows, but it is a journey. It's a quest, a thirst for knowledge. In some ways, that addiction that I had, that initial rush of finding results, fueled me and propelled me into looking for more questions and more solutions. But the next one I had was my PhD, which was initially starting in gene therapy, which is a new technology that was being looked at across the world for liver. And I decided to do a cell transplant for my PhD in mice. And we successfully did that for my PhD, where we used mice with Wilson's disease and used a liver cell transplant. And from that development, I then went on to undertake Australia's first liver cell transplant. And it was the 66th liver cell transplant in the world. And we successfully undertook it. I actually did the injection of the cells, which is pretty scary because you could potentially kill a child when you inject cells into their portal vein in order for them to grow as a little patient with Crigler-Najjar. And you're using a donor liver, which is a very, very precious gift from somebody, unfortunately, who had died. And it worked for a few months and was very thrilling that we spent 8 years for this moment and we'd managed to achieve this. But then the graft failed. And up until that time, no one had published any research into why these grafts were failing. There'd been 66 liver cell transplants. Some of them had worked. None of them had survived long term. So with some other researchers, I undertook some research into understanding why this liver cell transplant had failed. And we discovered that it was rejected. These cells were rejected. And prior to that research, we had thought that you just needed to have an ABO match like you do for a whole organ transplant. And what we discovered is you needed HLA compatibility like for a bone marrow transplant, which means that we needed more immunosuppression, including myelosuppression and better matching. And that was a great, and definitive research outcome. But what effectively it did was it shut the whole field down internationally. And that was an enormous challenge for me because I had young children at the time. I put my life and soul into it. I felt like I'd almost put my children's lives on hold to be able to do this research. So it was huge to have to face what I thought at the time was a massive failure. But I do remember a few years later when I was writing up my CV to apply for a fellowship, and one of my colleagues said, well, you proved that liver cell transplantation wasn't ready for clinical application. So it took me a number of years to get over that failure, but that was a different way of looking at it. And I was grateful that person gave me that sort of perspective because I was proving using science a negative, which is a very heart-rending thing to do, but it was the right thing to do, and have the backbone to actually say that and actually destroy what I was doing at the same time was really, really confronting. But it made me a stronger person to realize that you might wish for a result, but as scientists, we are slave to the discipline of truth seeking, and that you sometimes need to make tough decisions because the science is telling you that. So that's the challenge. I then went on to work in hemochromatosis and learnt a lot of epidemiological skills about population-based genetic screening, and it was on the back of my uncle passing from hemochromatosis, which is a completely preventable disease, and was very successful in getting grants in that area. That's another whole conversation, but learnt skills at that time. Then I applied to my gastroenterology practice, where we found more and more children were presenting to us with food allergy at the time, and I wanted to know why. So that launched this whole interest in food allergy, which launched a 15-year research program, which I'm very, very proud of, which is now being taken on by other leaders in allergy. A huge amount of people that I've collaborated with, both in Australia, but right across the world, including Ruby. I'm very proud to have worked with some amazing scientists. And we launched trying to understand why food allergy seemed to be on the rise. We didn't know if it was on the rise. We wanted to prove it, and we were open-minded. We did the first large cohort study of food allergy in Australia and the largest single-centre trial in the world called Health Nuts. And I'm very proud of the fact that this study is now being followed up 15 years later. These children, the people who I've left behind, are still doing the research, and Rachel Peters is now leading a 15-year follow-up of the Health Nut study of 5,300 children who are providing the most amazing level of evidence about all sorts of things to do with allergy in Australia and how the allergy epidemic is playing out in my community.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was really a wonderful, meaningful story, and something that I think will be so stimulating to young scientists, because you showed that failure was actually the stepping stone to success, to see where you are today, to be able to be open-minded, to accept that kind of failure, which was actually a success, but then turned out to be negative. And the fact that you mentored so many people who are continuing this process of science as you have moved away into a different sphere. So, as a clinician scientist, what motivated you to take up politics and public policy?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I was absolutely had the most amazing clinical and scientific career. I loved it. But for me, I was doing a lot of advocating both nationally and internationally about public health. So I got involved in changing infant feeding guidelines, both at the national level and the international level, which is enormously satisfying using the evidence to then influence public policy. But I felt that there was more that I could do. And I became very interested in obesity prevention and did some WHO work. And as a gastroenterologist, that was very interesting to me. But I realized many of the solutions for things like the non-communicable diseases of the 21st century, what's called the affluenza, whether it's allergies or obesity, asthma and cancer, a lot of them have much more to do with more lifestyle factors. Stopping smoking, better exercise, better diet. And those things are much larger and at the societal level. And there are not many people who have a health background that are influencing the policies and levers inside the tent that is a democracy or a parliament. And so I decided to put my hand up as someone who has lots of experience and skills to help get inside the tent to make good and wise decision making for the benefit of the health, safety and prosperity of our country. And it's interesting. I went to see the CEO of the Royal Children's Hospital, and she said to me, when I said I was thinking of running for politics, she said, "Oh my goodness, that's bold, that's brave." And then she said something that made me realize she really got what I was doing it for. And it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, actually. She said, Katie, I can't think of a better way to serve my country. And I'd always heard about serving my community, and I'd done that my entire life as a doctor. But she was right. I was wanting to put my hand up to serve my country. And I have to say, it's been a wonderful journey. I've very much enjoyed being a politician. But the skills that I have learnt on my journey to this point have been used each and every day. They're almost the same skills. But I'm very pleased that I've learnt those skills in a safe and supported environment like health and research, and then to be able to take them into the bullpit that is politics. I think I'm older and wiser now, and I feel more comfortable about being able to do it and staying true to myself, true to my values, and true to my community.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was again excellent, and I had a glimpse of this vision of yours through your acceptance speech, which I listened to, and I think I had tears in my eyes listening to it because it was so moving and it was so clearly from the heart. And I think anything that comes from the heart has to be from a very driven person and somebody who knows exactly what they want to do and somebody who puts themselves forward for service before self. So I think you are really a prototype of that, where you put service before self. And I was just thinking that you already covered some of those aspects, but just to say a little bit more of how you could apply your scientific knowledge to public policy and policy changes in Australia to help the community that you are serving now.
Thank you, Ruby. And thank you for mentioning my first speech. It's sometimes called maiden speech. And just as a backstory to that speech, I remember I wrote a draft of it and then I really had writer's block. And the Prime Minister's speechwriter said, "How are you going with your first speech? It's due very soon." And I said, "Paul, I just can't write this. I have writer's block. I've written a draft, but it's so terrible. It's completely self-indulgent. It makes me cry every time I try to read it." And he said, "Do you want me to come and listen?" And I said, "Oh, that'd be great. I'm not a politician, so I'm not sure what these first speeches are meant to be like." Anyway, he sat down in my office and I read him the first couple of pages, and he actually had a tear running down his cheek. And he said, "Katie, that's word perfect. It's you. That's the speech you have to give." And I was so grateful that somebody who'd been writing speeches for our Prime Minister gave me the confidence to say, just go with what feels right to you. It's the speech you have to give. And subsequently, I've actually spoken to a group called the Motherless Daughters Group. And they have 300 or 400 women who meet on the week before Mother's Day to share what it's like to be a motherless daughter, because I lost my mother 25 years ago, or actually 30 years ago now. And I read out my first speech, or the first part and the last part, because they asked me to, because they had heard it. And I realised it was actually an ode to my mother. And I hadn't realised that until after I'd written that first speech, but clearly it was a speech that I had to give. And it was, my mother is by my side guiding me. And the reason I got into politics is I have 4 beautiful children and a lovely husband. And I want to make sure that I can leave the world a better place for them and their generation and for those who follow. And I'm sure many people who are serving, whether it's through medicine or research or who are online listening, feel the same way themselves. Is what can we do collectively better to make the world a better place? And sometimes it means being in tough places, making tough decisions. And hopefully, if you've got the right value set, that you can make those decisions. But I feel very privileged to be in a position where I'm hearing a lot of different information across a lot of different things. I sit on many committees in the Parliament, which are bipartisan, both across the aisle. The Science Committee and the Health Committee, for example. And for instance, with the Science Committee, I was able to call for recycling and waste inquiry, which is called Rubbish to Resources, Enabling the Circular Economy for Australia. And I also called for an allergy inquiry in the Health Committee. And we've just completed an allergy inquiry, which is called Walking the Allergy Tightrope. And we're waiting for the Minister's reply to this inquiry, which had 24 recommendations, including funding for some of the important research and clinical applications that my colleagues have been leading. And I'm very pleased to be advocating for this great evidence-based approach to helping patients with allergy. So being on a committee means that I can help advocate for an evidence-based approach in Parliament to inform delivery of government services. And then I suppose the other thing is my electorate of Higgins is very, very clear that they want action on climate. And from the day that I've been elected, I've had a very strong voice inside the coalition government for action on climate. I'm very proud of the contribution I have made. And that was in my first year. In the second year, unexpectedly, COVID came along. And being a public health professional, I had a very clear idea of what was happening and why and what we should do about it. And I've had a strong and influential voice inside government. And the Minister for Health, Mr. Greg Hunt, has been incredibly generous in enabling me to speak with him and support his decision making. And it's a great privilege again to be in the right place at the right time to help make decisions that have influenced the way that our government and our country has fought the great pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And, it's a small contribution, but it's satisfying to think that some of the decisions I made, including supporting the decisions about closing our borders and making sure that we locked down early and that we had a good response to COVID. We're now struggling a bit with our COVID vaccine rollout. I've been a strong voice for saying we should support AstraZeneca. Those sorts of decisions and influences obviously influence the way our country responds to something like this, which obviously is hopefully going to be setting us up for a good post-COVID position once we get to the other side of the pandemic that we are all facing. And I will say that 2020 is the year that has changed everyone's life. There'll be a pre-2020 and a post-2020 approach. And all of us in health have made a contribution to the way that our communities or our country are responding to COVID in our own way, whether it's informing patients about the allergic consequences of a certain interaction or intervention, or encouraging them to get the vaccination, or doing telehealth instead of seeing patients face to face, or making sure we remind them to wash their hands and use masks and keep physical distance. I know that everyone in the health community has been doing their bit using evidence-based, expert-informed approach.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was brilliant. In fact, you've answered the last question that I had actually was going to ask you about your role in the committees. And as you rightly said, I think it was more like a predestined or lucky for Australia to have had you in that position, for climate change, which is very much close to our heart as Apaaaci as an organization. We've had a white paper on biodiversity, climate change, and air pollution, including highlighting also the Melbourne thunderstorm issue. And, this is very close to our heart as an organization. Allergy, again, walking the tightrope that you talked about is, again, so much close to our heart. So we're very grateful for all what you're doing there. And for COVID-19, you've already been part of our Apaaaci Allergy Week, talking about the importance of vaccination. So we're so grateful for all what you're doing in Australia, which I think actually has its impact across the countries, because a country that is doing well is always seen as an example for other countries to follow. So we deeply appreciate everything. We are so proud that our colleague is in a position to make these influential changes that can actually change the lives of patients. And I think ultimately that's what we all want. We want to be of service. And like you rightly said, we want to leave the world a better place than we came into. We want to be able to make a difference to the community that we live in, and it's service before self. And you have embodied that in your actions, and it started from your so-called maiden speech, which brought tears to my eyes too, as I said before. So thank you very much, and we look forward to having you again on our different programs.
Thank you, Ruby, and thank you for all that you're doing. And I know Apaaaci is a wonderful organisation bringing like-minded people together to help patients with allergies. So thank you so much.